Hello again, and good morning from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. I try to emulate or imitate a British accent because this video concerns the Freedom House report for 2019 concerning the United Kingdom, or to use a short form term, Britain. Britain attained, by the way, a nearly perfect score, 94 points out of 100. Britain was one of the first countries in the world to embrace a constitutional, limited democratic monarchy. Although it should be noted that until now, Britain still does not have a single unified document, which would be called the Constitution of the United Kingdom. Instead, it has a series of laws that the English and later British parliaments have passed over some or several centuries, which have a constitutional nature. And then it has a number of conventions, such as the fact that normally the British Prime Minister or the head of the British national government is the leader of the majority party or of the party holding the largest number of members in the British Parliament's lower house, the House of Commons. And then that if the government loses a specific vote of no confidence, for example, its budget is rejected, or then there's an explicit vote of no confidence, be it reserved that this House does not have confidence in the current government, then the government either must resign or then early parliamentary elections must be called. At least if the specific non-confidence motion demands early elections, or then if there's a later separate vote taken whereby a two-thirds majority, I think it is now a two-thirds majority requirement according to the Fixed Parliament Acts, then early parliamentary, or as they are called in Britain, general elections must be held. So the process took hundreds of years. Gradually, already starting in the 12th or 13th centuries, or even in the late 11th century, when William the Conqueror was the Duke of Normandy, of Scandinavian origin, by the way, sailed across the English Channel to England, and then in the Battle of Hastings defeated King Harold of Anglo-Saxons, who was also killed in the battle. So he started to meet gradually with barons and other nobles, but also with commoners, such as merchants, and then a clergyman. And gradually, two parliamentary bodies formed, the House of Commons being the lower house, and the House of Lords representing the high-ranking aristocrats and clergymen, such as bishops. And although various English monarchs violated, for example, the Magna Carta, which led various realistic British politicians, such as the great Prime Minister Winston Churchill, to dismiss it as more symbolic gesture, a kind of temporary concession to those English people who were demanding their rights, rather than a truly significant step forward. Because, for example, Magna Carta demanded trial by jury in order for an Englishman to be legally deprived of life, liberty, or property, or the right to continue to live in England. Then England was briefly a republic, or the so-called Commonwealth, from 1649 to 1660, most of that time under Oliver Cromwell. The Commonwealth started when the deposed Charles Stuart, the former King Charles I of England, Wales, and Scotland, and well, also of Ireland, was beheaded, having been sentenced to death for treason. And to put a long story short, Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, and his son Richard did not prove capable of governing England, or what would later be called Great Britain. And so in 1660, eventually and peacefully, Charles II, the beheaded monarch's oldest son, became king. And then he died in 1685, and his brother and successor, James II, was agreed to return England to the Roman Catholic Church. And many English Protestants, not only Anglicans, but also Puritans and then so-called nonconformists, such as Baptists and evangelicals who did not want to belong to the Anglican Church because of their theological beliefs, such as belief in believers' baptism and the separation of church and state, and the effort to institute a church or congregation of true believers only. Or, for example, the famous English preacher and writer of the late 17th century, John Bunyan, world famous for his books such as The Pilgrim's Progress and Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. He was a nonconformist, a Baptist. Then they obviously also were passionately against any move to return England to Roman Catholicism. So, to put a long story short, what ensued was the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which led to James II's abdication and to his flight to France, where he lived for the rest of his life, under the protection of the absolutist French king and fellow Roman Catholic ruler Louis XIV, Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King. But back in England, the Dutch-born King William co-ruled the country with the English-born Queen Mary, and the Bill of Rights passed by the English Parliament and ratified by King William in 1689 instituted, for example, the legal rights of Englishmen. Women were not yet considered legally persons until the early 20th century, at least according to the British Privy Council's Judicial Committee, when a Canadian woman raised that question in the 1920s. But then shortly thereafter, the British Privy Council corrected its archaic opinion and declared that women were, in fact, legally persons. And then one of the most important provisions was that the king would have, or the queen, would have to have the parliament meet regularly, and the parliament would have to approve the new laws, including the laws to raise taxes. And then there should be no excessive fines or bails, and no cruel and unusual punishments, which of course were interpreted in various ways, but gradually led to the abolition of the death penalty, I think, in the 1950s or 1960s in Britain. And then that there should be no standing armies, in other words, no peacetime military service or conscription. And the Bill of Rights formed the basis for the English and later British constitutional monarchy, despite the fact that the country still lacks a unified British constitution, unified written British constitution. And then in 1707, due to the Act of Union, England became known as Great Britain because the Scottish and English governments and parliaments were united. While England and Wales had already for some centuries, I think since the 14th century, been practically united. And then another Act of Union in 1801 united Great Britain with Ireland, and therefore the country became known officially as the United Kingdom. And then once Ireland split up in 1922, Southern Ireland forming the Irish Free State, the official name of the country of Britain became known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So in 1721, the head of government for the first time became known as the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, fulfilling this post until 1742. And gradually in the 18th and 19th centuries, the British kings and Queen Victoria attended the cabinet meetings less frequently, and in practice, Britain became a parliamentary constitutional monarchy. Not yet a democracy, because until the Reform Acts of 1832, 1867 and 1885, a majority of even the British adult men could not vote. And according to a book which I took selected photocopies on at the University of Helsinki, or in one of its libraries in the early years of this century, so back in Finland, the British electorate only comprised as late as during the First World War, so from 1914 to 1918, just 60% of the adult men. Why? Because so many men moved around in search for work, and so many still were so poor that they could not meet the minimum requirement for either paying rent or regular taxes, and paying regular rents or taxes, or owning a certain amount of property. So to put a long story short, in 1918, Britain finally implemented the universal suffrage for virtually all British male citizens, while excluding some minor groups like those who were serving prison terms, or were declared legally insane, or did not have a legal address. But a great majority of the British adult men acquired the right to vote, effective with the 1918 British general elections, if they were at least 21 years old and British citizens. And also, most British women aged 30 and above could vote if they owned property valued, if they or their possible husbands owned property valued at £10, 10 British pounds. In the late 1920s, this slight property requirement was removed, and all the British women who were neither prisoners nor declared insane legally, and nor being vagabonds, in other words, people with no known address, received the right to vote if they were at least 21 years old. And in the late 20th century, as in most other Western democracies, the right to vote, the minimum age was dropped to 18. And with the introduction of mass democracy, of course, the political parties became more organized already with the introduction of mass male democracy in the late 19th century, and even more so when women acquired the right to vote on an equal footing with women by the late 1920s. So the two main British parties, political parties since the 1920s, have been the centre-right Conservative Party and then the centre-left or moderately left-wing Labour Party. In practice, there isn't that much difference between their policies anymore, except that the Conservatives still, to some extent, favour even more right-wing economic policies. There is a small, but not very prominent, and certainly not very loud or influential, Christian or religious right on the right-wing fringes of the Conservative Party. In any case, among the rather few regular churchgoers of Britain, clearly more are either members or sympathizers of the Conservative Party, or consider the Conservative Party the lesser of the two evils than are Labourites, even though the Labour Party still had, in the late 20th century, a kind of Christian socialist wing. Some of its most prominent recent members were former Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who were collectively in office from 1997 to 2010 as British Prime Ministers. They succeeded each other. So religion is not a major factor in British politics, except for a relatively small percentage of the active voters, because so few Britons are either actively practicing Christians or otherwise deeply religious people. And some of them even don't vote, at least not regularly, because they consider politics so far removed from biblical Christianity or other forms of conservative or fundamentalist religion. And so many have lost their faith of trying to make the world into a better place through politics. Britain, since the late 20th century, has been becoming increasingly a multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious, and of course, multi-ethnic and multiracial country. There are significant minorities, especially in the major British cities such as London, Manchester, Cambridge, Oxford, Edinburgh, Belfast, and so forth, and Cardiff and Leeds and York, of people of African, Asian, Latin American, and Oceanian origin. Many of them are descendants of people who moved during the decolonization process from the 1940s to the 1970s to Britain, for example, in search for better economic opportunities and to escape the turmoil that sadly was one of the negative, and tragically was one of the negative byproducts of decolonization. So with this multiculturalization, multi-ethnicization, multi-linguisticization, multi-religiousization, but also profound secularization, the British national identity has become very variable, and a notable percentage of Britons don't really have a firm national identity anymore, or don't want to openly promote it, especially if it's a white British national identity, for fear of being labeled intolerant or racists. Although there are a number of white Britons who are able to combine skillfully and moderately nationalism with internationalism and patriotism with multiculturalism, which is a great accomplishment on their part. So even though there are two major political parties only, there are a large number of minor parties, although only a few of them, or only several of them, hold seats in the British House of Commons, most prominently the separatist left-wing Scottish National Party, and then the centre-left Liberal Democratic Party, and then there are minor regional and nationalist parties such as the Plaid Cymru from Wales, and then the Democratic Unionist Party, although that actually favors continued union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And then I have to look at the list. Well, the Sinn Féin members do not take their seats, even if they are elected to the British Parliament, because then they would have to swear allegiance to the British monarch, which they don't wish to do. But they do take their seats to the Northern Ireland Assembly, or in the Northern Ireland Assembly. So in the 2019 British general election that was held on Thursday, December the 12th, 2019, the British Conservative Party under the new Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who had taken office in July 2019, received 43.6% of the vote and a reasonably large majority of seats, 365 seats out of 650. So representing 56.2% of the vote. So it got an overrepresentation of over 12%. The British Labour Party, which under its then leader Jeremy Corbyn ran on an avowedly left-wing, even socialist platform, arguably the most socialist platform or manifesto, as the British political jargon term goes, the most socialist election manifesto that the party had had since 1983, when Professor Michael Foot was painfully and easily defeated by then British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And one cynic even called the election manifesto the history's longest suicide note. Professor Foot, for example, favored the unilateral disarmament, nuclear disarmament if necessary, and the separation of Britain from the European communities. Incidentally, also, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was critical of European federalism, and then, as we know, at the end of January 2020, Britain exited the European Union, and at the end of December 2020, the transitional period will end, after which the European Union will regard Britain as a so-called third country, which is neither a member of the European Union nor a membership applicant. Anyway, under Mr. Corbyn, the Labour Party suffered a painful defeat, only getting 32.1% of the vote and dropping to 202 seats out of 650, or about 31.1%. So, as often has happened in the recent several elections, the Labour Party, if it hasn't won, then it has received approximately its proportional share of the seats, because it has notably strong areas, for example, in Northern England, traditional in Scotland, but not since the Scottish National Party's electoral successes of this early 20th, first century, partly in Wales also. The Scottish National Party, which, true to its name, ran candidates only in Scotland, only got 3.9% of the popular vote, but was able to secure 46 seats, so 7.1%, so it got roughly twice as many seats as it should have got otherwise. The Liberal Democrats were able to increase their percentage to 11.6%. However, they lost one seat and ended up with only 11 seats, so 1.7%. No wonder they have been out of the mainstream British political parties, the party most strongly advocating the adoption of either proportional representation, where several political parties would receive roughly the same percentages of the seats or elected members as they have received of the votes, or at least the alternative vote or additional member system, which is incidentally the electoral system used to elect the Scottish Parliament's members, and I think a variant of it is used also to elect the Welsh Assembly's members. And also, well, the Northern Ireland Assembly, I believe it is elected using a form of proportional representation. And then there were a number of minor parties which also won one or more seats. The Greens were able to, or environmentalists were able to secure one seat with 2.7% of the vote. The Democratic Unionist Party, which strongly favors the continued union between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, secured 8 seats only, with 0.8% of the vote. Sinn Féin got 7 seats, but because Sinn Féin doesn't want to recognize Northern Ireland's continued union with Great Britain, at least not on its current terms, then the elected Sinn Féin members of the House of Commons do not take their seats. Sinn Féin only got 0.6% of the vote because it ran candidates or fielded candidates only in Northern Ireland. Plaid Cymru secured 4 seats with 0.5% of the votes, the Welsh Nationalist Party. Then the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, a liberal and centrist political party, got one seat with 0.4% of the votes. The Social Democratic and Labour Party of Northern Ireland got 2 seats with 0.4% of the votes. The Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, was re-elected, and before his election as Speaker, he was a Labour Party Member of Parliament. No other parties won seats. So Britain has a multi-party but two-party dominant political system. So there are concerns. Well, the voter turnout has been steadily declining since the late 20th century. In one early 21st century parliamentary election, I think it was only under 60%, because of a growing number of criticism, cynicism, apathy, and a feeling that whoever is in power will not be able to accomplish much for the ordinary people. And also because there are these special interest parties like the Brexit party of Nigel Farage, who incidentally got no seats. Or then the United Kingdom Independence Party, which didn't get any seats either. Yeah, the Brexit Party fielded 275 candidates and got 2% of the vote, but was unable to win any seats. The United Kingdom Independence Party fielded 44 candidates and got 0.1% of the vote. But then a bigger concern is national unity. Ironically, although the devolution plan presented by former Prime Minister Tony Blair of the Labour Party in 1997 about the election of regional assemblies with significant power to tax their citizens and other residents, legal residents in Wales and Scotland, even though it was supposed to quell the separatist tide, especially in Scotland, actually it has failed to do so. And in September 2014, as the well-informed viewers of this video will remember or know, there was a referendum on independence in Scotland where 1.6 million voters, or about 45% of the Scottish voters who turned out and cast eligible ballots, favoured independence from Britain, in other words, separation of Scotland from Britain, while about 2 million voters, or 55%, according to at least one media report which I read or heard, composed largely of older Scots, most of whom favoured continued union between Scotland and Britain. So it was defeated. However, the Scottish National Party, which still forms the regional government in Scotland, could easily hold another referendum in the future, especially after Brexit is finalized on December the 31st, 2020. And since the Scottish National Party is far ahead of the other parties, including the Labourites and the Conservatives in Scotland, it's likely to win another Scottish general election, which of course is bad news for the Unionists in Scotland who would like to retain the union between Scotland and Britain. Should Britain become even officially a federal monarchy, is the establishment of an elected English regional parliament, although many Britons would consider that a rather superfluous move, given the fact that about 5/6 of Britain's legal residents live already in England. How many seats would it have, and how would it differ from the British Parliament's lower house, the House of Commons? Another solution would be to establish regional assemblies For example, one for southern England, another one for the Midlands, the third one for northern England. In which case, England would essentially be broken up for regional administration purposes into three parts. And we have to remember that back in June 2016, when there was the referendum on Brexit organized by the government of then British Prime Minister and Conservative leader David Cameron, some 52% nationally voted for the proposition that Britain should exit the European Union. However, the people opposing Brexit were in a slight majority in Scotland. No wonder the Scottish First Minister or Regional Prime Minister Nicola Sturgeon is strongly in favour of holding another referendum on independence. And should the referendum pass, then obviously whoever is the British Prime Minister then, the current Prime Minister and Conservative leader Boris Johnson or someone else, will not force Scotland to remain inside Britain. However, there may be months or, in the worst case scenario, even years of legal disputes over, for example, the division of the British national government's property, because the British national government has property also in Scotland. And then what amount of money should the remainder of Britain pay to Scotland to help it in the economically difficult transition period? Should the legal residents of Scotland still be able to hold British passports, or should they file a separate application to hold them? Or should there be no dual citizenship between Scotland and Britain, or the remainder of Britain? And then what would be the bilateral agreements, political, social, cultural, economic, educational, and even military ones between the remainder of Britain and Scotland? And then would Scotland join the European Union as an independent country? Then what form of government would Scotland adopt? Would it have a parliamentary monarchical system, which of course would necessitate the appointment and or the election of a monarch, or would it adopt a parliamentary republican, small r republican system? Most of the republics fully located in Europe are parliamentary republics, where the president has either fully or mostly ceremonial, symbolic, and traditional powers, such as making speeches, nominating and appointing the prime minister or the head of government and the country's executive leader, and the prime minister's cabinet or government, symbolizing national unity, appealing for calm and tolerance, for respect for the human rights and minorities' rights, and generally speaking, being much like a constitutional monarch, except that even the parliamentary republic's presidents are actually elected, whether directly or indirectly, and they are term limited, normally holding office for no more than 2 terms. And then if Scotland managed to separate, what would become to Wales? What would become of Wales and Northern Ireland? Or would the remainder of Britain then have to become a federal parliamentary monarchy, much like Belgium is, with autonomous regions? Or in order to retain Britain's national unity, would the entire Britain have to become a fully devolved and highly federal parliamentary monarchy, similar to Belgium? Britons, generally speaking, politically are quite great pragmatists. So relatively few British politicians, especially mainstream ones, are strongly ideological, but dominant are the politicians who view politics as the art of the possible, and who strongly oppose strict ideological solutions to complicated socioeconomic political and other problems. So the British Conservative Party is clearly, by its mainstream, to the left of the US Republican Party, which could be considered a rather right-wing party, except that it does contain some liberal and even centrist elements. For example, people who favor abortion and or same-sex marriage, who favor some form of national or federal health insurance, who strongly oppose any kind of racism or racial or ethnic discrimination or religious one, who strongly object to singling out Muslims as the problem Americans. And there are many more such moderate conservatives and social liberals in Britain, of course, because the British political culture overall is clearly to the left of the US political culture. And then who largely treat Christian or other religious faith as everyone's private matter, which should not be much advertised or promoted in politics. While such activity is not banned by any means in Britain among the mainstream political parties, including the Conservative Party, whose right-wing elements have a kind of an uneasy alliance with the Christian right, even the mainstream conservatives, many of whom are social liberals, like the current Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was quoted maybe in either the Time magazine or some other international magazine or The Economist as asking concerning the issue of same-sex marriage, I can't understand what all the fuss is about. In other words, he had no problem with accepting same-sex marriage, while the more traditional conservatives would still quietly favor the return of the legal definition of marriage as the union of one man and one woman. But there aren't so many, even nearly as many radical conservatives or radical Christian right, or should I say strongly fundamentalist Christian right members in Britain as there are in the United States, who strongly push for legislation to overturn and abolish the law that legalized same-sex marriage, or those who would passionately want to restrict abortion to the medical emergencies. Okay, after this rather lengthy introduction, hopefully you are still there watching this video lesson, and let's go to the actual Freedom House report. So a nearly perfect score, 94 points out of 100. Political rights, almost perfect score, 39 out of 40. Civil liberties, a slightly reduced score, 55 out of 60. So the United Kingdom, which includes the constituent countries or regions of England, Scotland, and Wales, along with the territory of Northern Ireland, and then a number of smaller dependencies like the Guernsey and Jersey Islands in the English Channel between Britain and France, the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea between Ireland and Britain, and then the Shetland and Orkney Islands to the north of Scotland, the Outer Hebrides to the northwest of Scotland and Northern Ireland, and then Gibraltar, and then such distant overseas territories as the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina, or the eastern coast of Argentina, is a stable democracy that regularly holds free and fair elections and is home to a vibrant media sector. While the government enforces robust protections for political rights and civil liberties, recent years have seen concerns about increased government surveillance of residents, as well as rising Islamophobia, in other words, fear and hatred of Muslims, and anti-immigrant sentiment, not only towards Muslims, but even towards a number of fellow Europeans, such as Eastern and to some extent Southern Europeans, especially now that Britain has officially exited the European Union. They will take our jobs, they will work for too low substandard wages, such arguments. Or we just can't afford to have so many foreigners here. We need to protect the traditional British cultural values and identity, however they are defined. And then the Brexit referendum from 2016 is mentioned. And then the December 2019 British parliamentary general election. And then in October 2019, Britain and the European Union reached a transitional withdrawal agreement on their separation. However, they still, as far as I can remember from Euronews.com website, have not fully finalized the exit deal. Then in 2019, abortion and same-sex marriage were legalized in Northern Ireland by the national British government in lieu or in the place of a suspended power-sharing agreement between the region's Republicans, small R Republicans and Unionists. So the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are responsible to the House of Commons, while officially the last time when a British Prime Minister had to resign because, or in that case, call a general election, a snap general election, because he had lost the confidence of the House of Commons, happened back in 1979 when the Labour Party's leader, British Prime Minister James Callaghan, lost that vote of confidence by 1 vote and lost the ensuing snap federal national parliamentary or general election to the Conservatives under Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher herself was forced to resign due to a caucus or parliamentary, in this case, House of Commons group revolt in 1990. And one of the factors which forced former Prime Minister Theresa May to resign in 2019 was that her parliamentary group was divided over the Brexit deal. And then John Major was close to resigning in 1995 when he abruptly resigned and demanded a new mandate through the leadership vote by the British House of Commons' Conservative members, and he only received 3 votes more than his minimum target. So had he received 4 votes less than he had, he would therefore have resigned. And his last months before the May 1997 British general elections, he governed with a minority in the House of Commons. And there was infighting of a kind, or anyway, the late Prime Minister Harold Wilson had difficulty staying in power from 1974 to 1976. At first, he only got a plurality, and then he was able to secure a tiny 3-seat majority, which then was quickly lost after he was replaced in 1976 by fellow Labourite James Callaghan, and so forth. So Boris Johnson, who had previously served as Foreign Secretary, the British term for Foreign Minister, succeeded Theresa May as the British Prime Minister after she resigned as the leader of the Conservative Party, having won the internal contest to succeed her in late July 2019. So the British House of Commons has 650 directly elected members who are elected according to the first past the post or single member plurality system, in which the case there is only a single round of voting and whoever wins it is elected, regardless of his or her overall percentage of the vote. While the British House of Lords members are appointed by the monarch, currently Queen Elizabeth II, usually on the advice of the Prime Minister, often. As of 2019, there were 708 the House of Lords eligible. Currently, the House of Lords only can delay laws passed by the House of Commons by up to 1 calendar year. Britain's electoral framework is robust and well implemented, though a limited Organisation for Security and Cooperation Europe mission that observed the 2017 parliamentary elections urged lawmakers to boost transparency surrounding campaign financing and institute an annual cap or limit on how much a single individual could donate to a party or candidate. By the end of 2019, no such limit had been enacted. Britain's electoral infrastructure has had to contend with Russian interference dating back to the 2016 referendum on European Union membership. In November 2019, the British Broadcasting Corporation, or BBC, reported that Prime Minister Johnson's office was delaying the publication of a parliamentary report detailing allegations of Russian espionage, subversion, and interference. British political parties do not face undue restrictions on registration or operation. Opposition parties in Britain operate freely and have a realistic opportunity to increase their support and gain power through elections, especially currently the Labour Party. Theoretically, the Liberal Democrats could also gain votes and seats, and so could the Scottish National Party. People's political choices in Britain are generally free from dominant powerful groups that are not democratically, including the army, foreign powers, religious hierarchies, and economic oligarchies. Women, sexual minorities, and members of racial and ethnic minority groups have been able to gain a political voice through their participation in mainstream political parties. After the December 2019 general election, a record 220 members of the House of Commons, or 34%, in other words, 1/3, are now women. In 2019, 46 openly sexual minority candidates were elected to the British House of Commons. 62 members of the current British House of Commons elected in 2019 identify as members of ethnic minorities, including people of African and Asian descent. Despite this progress, a report published in July 2019 revealed the depth of sexual harassment and bullying in British politics, prompting a broadening of the complaint system to investigate historical harassment allegations. Britain's freely elected officials can generally make and implement or put into practice national policy without significant influence from actors who are not democratically accountable. However, this was tested with Prime Minister Johnson controversially attempting to prorogue or suspend the British Parliament in September 2019 to lessen the possibility of opposition members of the House of Commons interfering with his Brexit policy ahead of negotiations with the European Union that October. In late September 2019, the British Supreme Court found unanimously, without a single dissenting judge, that the decision to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification. Elections to the Northern Ireland Assembly took place in March 2017, but as of December 2019, legislators had failed to form a functioning government. The initial or first source of the impasse involved corruption allegations over a renewable energy incentive program, but long-standing disagreements on a number of issues between the two largest parties, the Unionists Sinn Féin and the Nationalist Democratic Unionist Party, stymied negotiations to break the deadlock. Although large-scale corruption is not pervasive in domestic British political and governance structures, and anti-corruption bodies are generally effective, Britain is increasingly coming under scrutiny for the ways in which its banking and financial sectors, property market, and offshore services in overseas territories enable money laundering and facilitate corruption globally. Members of the British House of Commons are required to disclose assets and sources of income, and this information is made available to the public. This is wonderful. For example, my distant native land, Finland in Northern Europe, does not require the members of its parliament to do so, although they can declare their assets and liabilities publicly if they so wish. However, the incoming cabinet ministers of Finland or members of the Finnish government do have to declare their assets and liabilities publicly. Press freedom is legally protected. The British mass media are lively and competitive and espouse viewpoints spanning the political spectrum. The British Broadcasting Corporation, which is publicly owned and relies on a dedicated television license fee for the majority of its funding, is editorially independent and competitive with its counterparts in the commercial market. However, Prime Minister Johnson has considered decriminalizing non-payment of the license fee and ordered a government review on the matter after his government's re-election in December 2019. Freedom of religion is protected in Britain in law and in practice. A law dating back to 2006 bans incitement to religious hatred with a maximum penalty of 7 years in prison. Nevertheless, religious minorities, especially Muslims, continue to report discrimination, harassment, and occasional assaults. Academic freedom is generally respected in Britain. However, the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2015 requires schools and universities to help divert students from recruitment into terrorist groups as part of the government's long-standing prevent strategy to combat or fight against terrorist and extremist recruitment efforts. Concerns about the effects of mass surveillance on free and open private discussion persisted in 2019. Because in Britain, the Investigatory Powers Act of 2016 requires communications companies to store metadata on customers' activity for 12 months, and in some cases allows this information to be accessed by police and other security officials without a warrant. Freedom of assembly in Britain is generally respected, though peaceful protests have found themselves under police surveillance for attending public events in recent years. Civic and non-governmental organizations generally operate freely in Britain. However, groups identified as terrorist organizations can be banned, and there are concerns that the relevant legal provisions are broad enough that they could allow the ban or prohibition of legitimate associations and activism. Trade unions in Britain represent 26% of British workers, the majority of whom are in the public sector. Unions have maintained an especially close relationship to the Labour Party. The British judiciary generally is independent, and governmental authorities comply with judicial decisions. A new Supreme Court began functioning in 2009, improving the separation of powers between the executive and judicial branches and even legislative branches of government by moving the highest court out of the House of Lords. There used to be a group of members of the House of Lords known as the Law Lords prior to 2009, or up to 2009. While due process generally prevails in Britain's civil and criminal matters, human rights groups and some figures within the judiciary have criticized severe cuts in legal aid under reforms that took place in 2013, which left many vulnerable people, such as handicapped people, without access to formal legal counsel, and also immigrants, especially those who have temporary visas only. Individuals living in Britain are generally or largely free from the illegitimate use of physical force and insurgent campaigns, but acts of terrorism did occur in 2019. In one of them, which happened in November 2019, 2 people were killed in a terrorist incident taking place near London Bridge. Foreign residents in Britain have been subject to increasing scrutiny throughout the 2010s as a result of the British government's ongoing hostile environment policy. This policy was created with the stated goal of persuading illegal immigrants either to leave Britain of their own volition or choose not to immigrate by strengthening immigration checks for individuals seeking public and private services. British citizens generally enjoy freedom of travel and choice of residence, employment, and institution of higher education. As Brexit negotiations continued in 2019, the possibility that a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because the latter entity has chosen to remain in the European Union, would again be imposed, contributed to concerns that the movement of goods and people across the border would be curtailed, and that the tensions that fueled the decades-long conflict starting in the late 1960s in Northern Ireland between radical Protestants and radical Catholics could resurface with the establishment of border checkpoints. In October 2019, the withdrawal agreement reached between Britain and the European Union specified that customs checks would take place in the Irish Sea, which is a sub-sea of the North Atlantic Ocean, forming the sea boundary between Britain and Ireland, and not a land border. British individuals may freely exercise the right to own property and establish private businesses. The British government generally does not place explicit restrictions on personal social freedoms, although these are governed differently in Northern Ireland, which maintains a distinct legal and political environment. Abortion and same-sex marriage, which became legal in the rest of Britain, first abortion in 1967 and same-sex marriage in 2014, were heavily proscribed or prohibited in Northern Ireland until 2019, when the British Parliament forced their legalization through the Northern Ireland or Executive Formation Act. A report published by a commission of the British government in 2016 expressed concern about the social and economic isolation of many members of ethnic and religious minorities and of the poor. According to the Office for National Statistics, income inequality remained stable at 32.5%, a trend that was partly the result of a cut in government benefits. The Modern Slavery Act of 2015 increased punishments for human traffickers and provides greater protections for victims. However, its implementation or putting into practice has been weak. In late October 2019, a shocking total of 39 Vietnamese migrants were found dead in a trailer in Essex, southern Britain. In December 2019, authorities charged 2 defendants with human trafficking offenses over the incident. Children and migrant workers are among those most vulnerable to forced labor and sex trafficking. So thank you so much for watching this video, and have a nice and safe and blessed weekend and the remainder of November and the upcoming Advent and Christmas season, and stay safe and free from the COVID-19 pandemic.